Letitia James, the sitting Attorney General of New York, was handcuffed in a grocery store for inspecting grapes too long. That is not a headline. That is a fact. She walked into Kingsley and Warren on a gray Friday afternoon wearing a beige trench coat, no badge, no staff, no fanfare. Just a canvas tote bag with 5 words printed in black. Truth never waits for permission. It was the kind of place where the silence hums louder than music, where even the polished floor seems to suggest you better look like you belong or leave. Westchester Heights wasn't just an affluent neighborhood. It was a curated ecosystem, and inside its crown jewel supermarket, Letitia didn't walk in as New York's top law enforcement officer. She walked in as a black woman in soft shoes, alone, and that evidently was enough to trigger the system. She wasn't there for headlines. She wasn't there to be seen. She paused at the produce aisle, calmly weighing the difference between red and green grapes, focused, unbothered, until the surveillance culture of polished privilege decided she'd lingered long enough. A teenage girl near the snack aisle lifted her phone, subtly tilted it toward Letitia. A store clerk near the dairy shelves bent down to tie her shoes without ever blinking, and somewhere behind the walls, someone pressed a button. Security to Section 4. Behavior alert. The intercom voice was smooth, generic, almost friendly. But Letitia had heard that tone before, not in stores, but in hearings, in briefings, in closed-door meetings where coded language was used to bypass accountability. 2 internal security officers materialized almost theatrically. One older, face unreadable like granite. The younger one rested his hand on his belt like it might suddenly have to defend itself. The older one didn't shout, didn't accuse. He simply asked, "Mom, why have you been pacing around the store without making a purchase?" Letitia's answer didn't rise in pitch or volume. It didn't need to. Didn't know indecision over grapes counted as suspicious conduct. She didn't flinch. She didn't escalate. But it didn't matter. The store manager arrived middle-aged, receding hairline, voice low and rehearsed. He didn't look at her. He looked past her. "Some customers," he said, "don't feel safe." She reached into her coat pocket, perhaps for her parking ticket, perhaps for her ID. But she never made it that far. The metal of the handcuffs locked before her fingers touched paper. One click, then another. Her wrists were bound. Not a single customer asked what she had done. Not one voice rose. Not one person questioned the rush to detain a woman whose only visible offense was being present. Vivaldi played through the speakers as if mocking the tension. Not loudly, just loud enough to remind everyone that the world outside this moment was continuing without pause. Letitia walked past the checkout lanes escorted by 2 silent guards. Mothers looked away. Children stared. Some eyes were wide, others narrowed. But no one stopped. Because in that place, with those floors and those suits and those whispers, she didn't look like she belonged. And that was all it took. That's the story. That's where it begins, not with a courtroom, not with a scandal, but with a woman picking fruit under fluorescent lights and being branded a threat before she ever opened her mouth. And if you're wondering how far a system will go to protect its image, stay tuned. Because Letitia James didn't just walk into that store. She walked into a machine, and the machine didn't recognize her face. But soon it would learn her name. No sirens, no flashing lights, no Miranda warning readout with theatrical pomp. Just a patrol car pulling into Precinct 36 like it was delivering groceries instead of a high-ranking official illegally detained for fruit shopping. They didn't slam the brakes. They didn't shout commands. Why would they? When the game is rigged, you don't need to draw attention, you just need to turn the key and watch the machine chew quietly. Inside, the paint peeled in uneven strips, and the fluorescent lights flickered like they were embarrassed to still be working. The air was thick with stale bleach and bad coffee, an aroma that could be bottled and sold under the label qualified immunity. No one asked her name. No one looked at her ID. No one said the words Attorney General. Letitia was now officially downgraded to female, loitering, uncooperative. In other words, black and present. One officer scribbled a vague intake code. Another checked his phone mid-process as if he were clocking into a shift at a burger joint, not authoring the beginning of a federal crime. In the far left corner sat Turner, the kind of public servant you don't meet, you detect. Square-shouldered, expressionless, sliding a cursor across the screen like a butcher slicing evidence off the bone. She hovered over a file titled Kingsley Main Aisle, 161753.mp4, paused for dramatic effect that no one would see, and dragged it into the trash bin with the ease of someone who's done it before. No password prompt, no supervisor, no hesitation. Poof. There goes probable cause. Letitia didn't protest. She didn't raise her voice or ask for counsel. She just looked. Turner's ID badge, the time on the wall clock, the half-used tin of powdered creamer next to the monitor. It was all being recorded, just not on camera. In the hallway, Officer Harris, whose claim to fame was escorting a woman in flats, spoke into his phone with the kind of confidence only mediocrity in uniform can afford. She's loitering. Dark coat, loud posture. No ID, loud posture. Now that's a felony. What next? Suspicious blinking. Unapproved breathing. But the real punchline wasn't the charge. It was the recipient. The report was headed to Judge Raymond Drake, a man who, 6 months prior, had sat across from Letitia in a Judiciary Committee hearing, looking like a wax figure melting under pressure. She'd questioned him, on the record, about civil case suppression, wrongful detentions, and his curiously consistent habit of ruling in favor of officers with missing body cam footage. And now, like a bad sitcom reboot, here he was still in power, still petty, and now about to receive a report from the very precinct she once investigated. Letitia realized something that should terrify anyone who still believes in the idea of oversight. This wasn't chaos. This was choreography. The kind of silent, bureaucratic ballet that only corrupt systems can perform flawlessly. Nothing was clumsy. Nothing was out of sync. The cuffs had clicked on cue. The footage had vanished on time. The script was already written. And Harris? He sat down to file his portion with the same care one might take posting on Facebook Marketplace. He typed with both index fingers. Subject showed signs of resistance and verbal aggression. Because of course she did. What other explanation could there be for a black woman in a trench coat evaluating grapes with too much intensity? Letitia sat in a cold steel chair, wrists still cuffed, eyes fixed on the dark screen where the evidence had once been. She didn't twitch, she didn't beg, but behind those eyes, something ancient stirred. Not rage, not panic, but clarity. It was all here. The mechanisms, the language, the familiar transitions from suspect to subject to unknown female. Everything she'd warned about in committee rooms was now being performed for her. Live without shame. She didn't need to see the next step. She'd already memorized it. And as one officer moved toward the printer with a manila envelope in hand, she didn't look away, because she knew that report wasn't about her. It was about everyone like her. And the ones writing it? They were too confident, too careless, too practiced, which made what was coming next all the more satisfying. because this time the paper trail was going to bite back. The phone was ancient, a beige rotary relic with a chipped corner and a crusted dial pad, probably older than half the officers in the building. It sat crooked on Turner's desk, half swallowed by a mess of styrofoam cups and post-it notes that read things like delete old shift logs and called Drake B410. Turner had stepped out to refill her coffee with the casual arrogance of someone who thought a woman in handcuffs couldn't dial a phone. Mitchell, meanwhile, was busy outside the hallway, likely whispering to some judge's assistant about how the suspect had a threatening aura. Letitia leaned forward with precision. Her wrists were still shackled, but her memory unshackled. She knew the phone system. She knew the codes. She knew how this precinct worked better than the buffoons running it. After all, she'd written half the legal frameworks they were about to violate. Her fingers, bruised at the joint from metal cuffs, moved quickly. She pressed the keys in sequence. R12. The emergency escalation line routed straight to the NYAG's private war room. 1 ring. 2. Then a voice. Cool but alert. Attorney General's office. Her answer was steady. It's me. Pause. A shift in breathing. The voice lowered its register, sharpened its edge. Are you safe? She didn't waste syllables. Precinct 36. Video erased. Mitchell and Harris involved. Drake backing the report. I need extraction. On the other end was Avery Ng, NYAG's lead counsel, a man who didn't blink unless the Constitution trembled. He didn't ask questions. He didn't say, oh my God. He didn't launch into legal hypotheticals. He issued one command, clear as a rifle shot. Activate Federal Task Force. Immediate warrant chain. We move tonight. Letitia hung up as calmly as she had dialed. No triumph in her eyes. No fear either. She adjusted her posture in the metal chair, let her shoulders square into the weight of what was about to come. This wasn't survival. This was calculation. What they thought was a soft kill and administrative mugging, a footnote arrest of a non-compliant female, was about to trigger a storm with jurisdictional fangs. And here's the joke. They had no clue. Not Mitchell, still rehearsing falsehoods in the hallway like a bad improv actor. Not Turner, whose coffee now had more legal weight than her chain of custody. Not Officer Harris, who would later claim he was just following verbal protocols. And certainly not Judge Drake, who probably thought revenge from a grocery aisle was beneath his docket. But this wasn't revenge. This was federal combustion. See that chipped old phone? The one covered in donut glaze fingerprints and indifferent bureaucracy? That phone had just flipped a switch that hadn't been touched since the Giuliani era. And the chair Letitia sat in, the one where they thought they'd broken her authority. It had just become the epicenter of a multi-agency response written in statutes, executed in real time. What made it all the more beautiful was the sheer stupidity of her captors. They didn't see it. They didn't even suspect. Letitia might as well have morphed into wallpaper as far as they were concerned. A silent file, a brown coat in a gray room, another black woman in the system, moved to holding until she stopped being loud. But Letitia James doesn't fade. She reconfigures. So as Mitchell re-entered the room, still clutching a folder labeled Pending Charge Draft, and Turner settled back into her desk, never noticing the phone's slight turn, Letitia simply breathed. Slow, precise, controlled. They thought they were watching her. They didn't know the countdown had already begun, because the floor under them was no longer theirs. The rules had changed, and every minute that ticked forward from that point wasn't time bought, it was time borrowed. From an authority they had underestimated, from a woman they had mistaken for harmless, and from a system they thought would never bite its own tail. But when federal boots hit that precinct, they wouldn't be knocking. They'd be unsealing, unwinding, undoing, and the first name on the arrest sheet? It wouldn't be hers. It would be the man who wrote loud posture into an official report. Now go ahead, file it, hit send. The server's still warm. The locks are still closed. The lights are still flickering. But not for long. It happened just after dawn, in the hour when even the boldest coffee can't cut the chill. 19 black SUVs glided into the Precinct 36 parking lot, engines humming like a warning. There were no sirens. This wasn't a raid for the evening news, but a surgical strike written in legalese and cold resolve. 26 federal agents, armored and anonymous, poured out in formation, moving with a choreography that made the precinct's officers look like amateurs at a high school play. This wasn't law enforcement. This was the law itself, arriving to collect receipts. Inside, Mitchell was still massaging his fiction into an official report. Subject verbally escalated, risk of harm imminent. He barely managed to cap his pen before a pair of gloved hands twisted his arms behind his back. "Wait, what is this?" he stammered, face slack with disbelief. The agent's reply was pure deadpan. "You have the right to remain silent. You should try it." Down the hall, Harris, forever attached to his mug, turned the corner straight into the business end of federal accountability. His coffee splattered against the floor as his arm was yanked back. I just was all he could sputter before being pinned to the wall. "Your badge doesn't work here," came the cold response. It's a remarkable thing to watch men so committed to avoiding responsibility finally run out of exits. Turner, queen of the digital eraser, returned to her desk in time to watch a federal agent confiscate her keyboard. The words, "evidence permanently removed," glowed on her screen. "We're pulling everything." "You just made it federal," the agent intoned, and even Turner's practiced blankness flickered. Upstairs, Chief Callahan, the sultan of plausible deniability, monitored chaos on the security screens. He made a break for the exit too slow. 2 agents stood waiting, warrant in hand. Robert Callahan, obstruction of justice, coordinated cover-up, and federal interference. No room for negotiation, not even a last word. Downstairs, the silence was thick, punctuated only by the zip of plastic cuffs and the deliberate rhythm of federal boots. The precinct's usual soundtrack of jokes and bravado had died, replaced by the collective realization that the system shield had finally shattered. It was in this vacuum, this beautiful stillness, that Letitia James emerged. Same beige trench coat, same implacable gaze. No cuffs, no handler. The agents fell back respectfully. Letitia walked through them steady, unhurried, as if she'd always known this moment would arrive. There were no speeches, no media scrum, just the echo of a system, finally forced to face the woman it tried to erase. And as Letitia passed the empty stares and hastily averted eyes, it was clear. The reckoning wasn't over. It was just warming up, and the next scene would not be staged by those who thought justice could be deleted with a keystroke. The hallway had never known silence like this, not the institutional kind that comes with thick walls and tired fluorescent lights, but the charged quiet that follows a storm and makes every footstep sound like a verdict. Letitia James, still in that now iconic beige trench coat, hair unbothered, face utterly composed, walked the corridor of Precinct 36 as if she owned it. The radios were off. The chatter was gone. Even the habitual bark of orders from behind the glass was silenced. All that remained was the steady, measured cadence of her shoes against linoleum, a sound that, for once, commanded more respect than any shouted command. Federal agents stood in two solemn rows along the walls, not as bodyguards, but as witnesses and, yes, in a rare twist for this building, as admirers. Their posture spoke not of caution, but of deference. Letitia didn't break her stride. She didn't pause to survey the lineup of faces, some ashamed, some inscrutable, a few defiantly blank. One young officer, barely out of the academy, met her eyes, then looked down, not from fear, but from the heavy recognition that his silence had spoken loudest when justice was on trial. That's the thing about moral reckonings. Sometimes it's not the volume of your voice, but the volume of your absence that echoes the longest. Letitia passed the reception desk, the very spot where, hours earlier, her identity had been reduced to female, aggressive stance, and little more. The incident report was still there, unsigned, already irrelevant paperwork awaiting a reality check. She took in the scene, every detail seared into her memory. She saw the remnants of the system's last stand, a half-finished form, a blinking cursor, the residue of bureaucracy's failed attempt to define her. At the far end of the hall, Avery Ung appeared, no jacket, no tie, just cool confidence and a nod that said everything words couldn't. He didn't offer congratulations or platitudes. He simply said, softly enough for only her to hear, "They didn't know who you were, but they will." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a promise. It was a statement of fact. Letitia offered no reply. She didn't need to. She glanced through the glass at the horizon where the first streaks of dawn cut through the gray. Sunlight spilled across the precinct floor, breaking the spell that had held this fortress in the dark for far too long. For the first time since its doors opened, Precinct 36 felt less like a fortress and more like a relic, no longer a stronghold for the untouchable, but a monument to the cost of underestimating the woman in the beige coat. The morning didn't just bring new light. It brought the certainty that, from now on, nobody in this building would ever confuse silence with safety again. And as Letitia walked on, it was clear. The days of being subject unknown were finished. The real story was just beginning. The courtroom was already humming with tension before the sun had fully breached the skyline. At 6:45 a.m., long before the morning anchors could stoke the outrage machine, 3 men sat in the defendant's row, stripped of their ties, stripped of their shields, stripped at last of the legal myths that had protected them. Chief Robert Callahan, Judge Raymond Drake, Mayor Glenn Wexley, the old guard of plausible deniability, now reduced to wrinkled shirts and hollow stares. Their alliance, forged in winks and whispered agreements, looked pitiful under fluorescent lights and federal scrutiny. Letitia James didn't bring a folder. No lawyers flanked her. She approached the witness stand alone, carrying nothing but memory, precise, damning, and unshakable. She met the gaze of the room with a composure that didn't ask for sympathy, just attention. Her opening, cut like a scalpel. They didn't just ignore who I was. They erased me on purpose. The statement landed like a gavel strike. No gasps, just the unmistakable ripple of discomfort among those who once profited from ambiguity. Letitia didn't miss a beat. She recited timestamps, file names, the exact strings Turner deleted. Kingsley, Maine, ISIL 16 to 1753.mp4, permanently removed at 3:11 a.m. She listed the telltale smudges on the keyboard, the sequence of keystrokes, the size of the file erased. She described the structure of the digital graveyard they'd built, cataloging every byte, every silent cover-up. Each fact was a small, cold dagger slipped between the joints of their old armor. She paused, then repeated the words Mitchell had hissed in the hallway, his bravado now echoing off the stone walls. "Make it stick. She's not walking out of this." Letitia's tone was flat. Unadorned, she didn't need to embellish the rot. The room went colder with every revelation. Reporters stopped jotting notes. Politicians looked up from their phones. No one dared interrupt. Not even the judge, now just another man in the dock, eyes glassy and damp. Toward the back of the gallery, an elderly woman dabbed at her cheek. She wasn't there for spectacle or headlines or vengeance. She was there because she, too, had once been subject unknown in a precinct that believed silence equaled power. Letitia saw her, nodded once, and continued, "I've read 1,000 reports like this. I never thought it'd become one." That admission, more than any accusation, peeled the final layer from the room's collective defense. And then, just as the weight of Letitia's testimony threatened to crush the last of their illusions, the rear door creaked open. All eyes turned as a figure stepped inside, unexpected, steady, holding not a weapon, but a simple USB drive. No one spoke, but the message was clear. The days of silent erasure were over, and the truth, at last, had found its way back into the room. The back door opened, and the hush in the courtroom was broken by the hesitant footsteps of a young woman, Elena Ortiz, the IT intern from Kingsley and Warren, clutching a USB drive like a lifeline. Her voice shook at first, but found its force. "Before they wiped the servers, I pulled a local backup." The judge gave a single nod, and the main screen glowed to life. For a moment, no one breathed. The video began. Letitia, at the grape stand, composed, unmoving as an officer closed in. She offered no resistance, not even a harsh word, only the simple act of existing in a place she'd been told. In every silent glance, she didn't belong. A second officer pressed her into the produce rack. A store employee lifted a phone to record, only to be ordered, "Delete that." The audio was unmistakable. The store manager's voice slicing through the white noise. "Make her move. Don't let her blend." A command so casual, it made the violence seem routine. Faces throughout the courtroom tightened, some in shame, others in fresh outrage. An elderly woman whispered, "It's just like what they did to my son." Her words barely a breath, but heavy as a verdict. The footage continued, cutting to Turner at her terminal, deleting the key file as if swatting a fly. Then Mitchell, his hands steady as he signed a fabricated report, time-stamped just 30 minutes after Letitia's arrest. The last clip came from the precinct's own surveillance. Mitchell, caught on camera, turning to a colleague and saying, "Well, say she resisted." Drake won't question it. The lie laid bare for all to see, no longer protected by paperwork or polite indifference. Elena, standing before the entire court, lifted her chin. "I saw them do it. I had to save something." No one responded. They didn't have to. In that moment, every mask of plausible deniability had been stripped away. The system, for so long adept at erasure, had finally been forced to face the evidence, and this time the truth was impossible to delete. After 2 relentless days in federal court, with testimony that left no shadow of doubt and witnesses whose accounts dovetailed with brutal clarity, justice arrived not with hesitation, but with finality. The sentences rang out. Robert Callahan, 33 years behind bars, with every penny of his wealth and business holdings seized. Judge Raymond Drake, 30 years in federal prison, his authority stripped for life, No more gavels, no more loopholes. Mayor Glenn Wexley, sentenced to 27 years for shielding abuse, misusing city funds, and laundering civil equity through backdoor deals. There was no mercy on the docket, only consequences. The court ordered all confiscated assets poured into the New Bronx Community Justice Fund, earmarked to restore the very neighborhoods these men had neglected and exploited. Letitia was nowhere to be seen as the verdict was read. She had left the city before dawn, her work finished long before the cameras could claim her victory as their own. Reporters called it the quiet exit that thundered, a departure so understated it echoed through the city's corridors of power. Later, at the final press conference, Avery Ung stood before a sea of microphones and made it clear. This wasn't just about Letitia James. This was about every file they tried to erase before it had a name. The city understood. For once, the system's reckoning was larger than the woman who had forced it, and the silence Letitia left behind spoke volumes. 21 days. That's all it took for an institution that spent decades shielding the powerful to be erased from the city map. Precinct 36 didn't go quietly. Its sign was the last thing to come down, and for a while, the neighborhood seemed to pause every time a truck rolled by the old building, as if the very bricks had to make peace with what they had witnessed. But the transformation was absolute. The old walls came down to the studs, the cells were ripped out, and what rose in their place wasn't just a remodel, it was a rebuke. The new name, gleaming in fresh brass above the glass doors, was the Rosa Civil Equity Center. There were no holding cells, no hard benches, no echoing corridors built to intimidate. Instead, visitors found sunlit classrooms, rows of bookshelves lined with case law and community histories, open offices where citizens could meet with legal advisors, and walls of glass that announced, "Nothing here is hidden anymore." The inscription by the entrance made it explicit. Where silence once ruled, justice now speaks. For the first time, people walked in with heads high, some to learn, some to seek help, some just to see if it was true. In the main office, Lisa Nguyen, once a rank-and-file officer nearly buried for filing a whistleblower complaint, sat behind a modest desk, now the director of New York's new Oversight Bureau. Her philosophy was taped front and center. "We don't punish officers, we protect the public." Lisa didn't run the center with an iron fist or with the suspicion that had infected the precinct in its final days. She ran it with transparency, inviting scrutiny, even from those who once doubted her resolve. The door to her office stayed open, her inbox overflowing with questions from block associations, student groups, and sometimes, quietly, from police officers themselves. Elena Ortiz, the intern whose courage helped expose the truth, was no longer invisible. The New York Times recruited her as a data analyst, where she used her skills to dig through police digital logs, finding stories that algorithms tried to bury. Her investigative column, Code to Cover Up, became essential reading for activists, attorneys, and anyone with a stake in justice. In every piece, Elena explained not just how the cover-ups worked, but how technology could be used to protect the vulnerable as well as the powerful. Upstairs, in a quiet second-floor office, one photograph on the wall captured the heart of the center's new mission. It wasn't a triumphant courtroom shot or a posed magazine cover. It was Letitia James in handcuffs, her face set, her gaze unwavering as officers led her through the aisles of Kingsley and Warren. Beneath it, in handwritten ink, were the words, "The moment they thought I was nothing, they showed the world who they were." Visitors often stopped to look, some lingering longer than expected, recognizing a defiance that needed no speeches, only memory. The Rosa Civil Equity Center quickly became more than a name change. School groups toured its classrooms, learning about their rights from former inmates who once feared the old system. Neighbors sought advice on everything from housing disputes to how to file a complaint against city agencies. Volunteer lawyers taught Saturday workshops. Community mediators held evening circles where old wounds were named and sometimes healed. The center, unlike its predecessor, wasn't built to last forever. It was built to evolve, to remind the city that accountability was a living, breathing process, one that required ordinary people to keep watch, to keep speaking, to keep insisting that silence would never again be mistaken for peace. Lisa Nguyen kept her office window open, letting the noise of the city, sometimes angry, sometimes hopeful, drift in. Elena Ortiz's column went viral, sparking a statewide audit of police IT practices. And that photograph of Letitia, always in sight, ensured that no one forgot where the new story began, not with victory, but with the courage to endure injustice and, in the end, make it answer. In a quiet corner of Brooklyn, the city's noise faded behind the heavy doors of an old building, now reborn as a community classroom. The sign was small, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Community Law and Justice. Instructor, Letitia James. Inside, there were no podiums, no aides taking notes, no live streams to chase headlines. Just a faded whiteboard, a circle of eager young faces, and Letitia herself no longer a headline, but a presence. Her history living proof that survival is not submission. Each week, as the class settled, Letitia started not with a lecture, but a question. What does the law mean if you don't know when it's being used against you? The words always landed hard. She didn't teach from textbooks, didn't recite theory. She taught from memory what it felt like to be pulled away while the world looked on in silence, the cold weight of cuffs, the quiet refusal to disappear. The students learned not from hypotheticals, but from the real scars of injustice. One afternoon, a student hesitated before raising her hand, then asked, "Do you ever regret not staying in office?" Letitia's answer was soft but resolute. Justice doesn't need a title. It needs someone who refuses to look away. The class was silent for a moment, considering the difference between power and responsibility. As the lesson ended and the students packed their things, a boy hung back, his backpack loose over one shoulder. He looked up, earnest and searching. "What made you stay and teach us?" Letitia knelt down to meet his gaze, her response a whisper only he could hear. "Because no one ever taught me what to do when the cuffs are already on." Outside, the afternoon sun caught the bronze plaque on the building's facade. It gleamed quietly, a promise etched in metal, that from a place built to break her, Letitia James now taught others how never to be broken again, not by fear, not by ignorance, not by silence. Here, law was more than words on paper. It was memory, vigilance, and the courage to face the truth. And in that small, sunlit room, justice didn't shout. It simply refused to disappear.